All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our workshop on the Pedagogy Inquiry Teams, a faculty-led, equity-focused inquiry and action process. My name is Ian Thomas Binyami. I'm a faculty member in the English department at DVC and one of the project coordinators for the Pedagogy Inquiry Teams.
Hi, I'm Chris Koblich and I teach art history at DVC. I'm also the faculty professional development coordinator and the co-coordinator with Ian of this project. And before we get started, we also wanted to acknowledge the design support that we've received from Mark Akiyama, who's also here, Dean of Special Projects overseeing guided pathways implementation at Diablo Valley College, and also Dr. Al Solano of the Continuous Learning Institute, who coaches DVC on guided pathways and on integrated planning.
We're really happy to be with you today and to share some information about the structure and the evolution of the Pedagogy Inquiry Teams project. We're going to be placing particular emphasis on some of the lessons we've learned that might help you in developing or strengthening similar projects at your own institutions.
And so we'd like to begin the session with a little bit of interaction. And Ian's about to post a link into the chat. So we want to begin by inviting you to share a little bit about the various activities at your college that might be related to some components of the Pedagogy Inquiry Team project that we're going to be describing. So you have the link in the chat to a Padlet where you'll be able to write down and respond briefly to the following questions. So we'd like you to share what kinds of pedagogy-related professional development your college currently supports, what equity initiatives your college may currently be running, and how your campus works with and uses data on student success. And we realize that these are all really big questions and big components of college work right now, that you could give quite detailed answers to these questions. But here, we're just kind of like looking for a general snapshot to give all of us a better sense of the kind of activities that may already be taking place at our colleges. And in order to respond, you can just click the little plus sign under any of the columns, and that will allow you to respond in that column. There's no sign in, so you can just post as you like. And just a note that using your college's jargon or acronyms as shorthand is totally fine. And the purpose of this exercise is to inventory what we currently do. So as you write down a few notes for each column, we'd like you to notice where your answers to these three questions overlap and consider whether your college has programs in place that already bridge data analysis, equity initiatives, and pedagogy. And we'll return to your responses as we move into this workshop and talk through them a little bit. And then we'll wrap up our session at the end of the 60 minutes with another activity that returns to the climate of your colleges. So just keep them coming and we'll go to the next slide and then check in.
That's great. I see him coming in already, so that's wonderful. In today's workshop, we'll describe the origins and the goals of the PIT, provide a brief overview of the inquiry and action cycle that's at the core of the work, provide some nuts and bolts information on the semester by semester structure of the project, and share some things that have already come out of this work. As we'll explain later in the presentation, this project has evolved in really interesting ways, and we want to make it clear at the outset that we're coming to you in the middle of our work, right? We're coming to you kind of in process, 1 year into what has developed into a 2-year reiterative cycle. As we move through this presentation, we invite you to write questions in the chat. We'll trade off on monitoring the chat and we'll try to respond to you so we can let you know if an answer is coming up in the presentation, or make a note that we'll address the question in the Q&A session later. So let's take a few minutes to check in on what folks have been posting into the Padlet. I see all those responses starting to pop up there.
Ian, can you repost the Padlet link as well? There's a request for it.
Thank you very much. There you are.
Okay, so we're going to take a look through here. Yeah, Canvas training, online teaching. Yeah, we're all there, right? That's such a huge component of what we've needed to do. yeah, the @ONE workshops I think are really such a wonderful resource. So we're seeing Puente for initiatives, and the guided pathways clearly is just really foundational to equity. And so then and keep them coming. Feel free to just continue to post. And so here we're seeing. Oh, this is interesting. I'm wondering if this is a counseling based initiative, or is it full college, this ORP for personality types. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that. Feel free to unmute and say more about that if you feel called to.
Yes, we're doing this. It's mostly just the head of the EMS department and myself in psychology. We're also doing some different interventions in terms of trying to build resilience for students going through this very stressful kind of program.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. That sounds fascinating. Thank you for posting about it.
Yeah,
okay.
And I see the comments on the equity initiatives, right? Those learning communities have, at our institution, those were some of the real kind of core, voices in a lot of the equity work that we've been doing across our campus, and it's kind of grown out of those communities. So that's definitely one of the homes of that kind of a conversation at our college as well.
All right, thank you. It's always just really fascinating to see what other folks are working on. All right, I'm going to switch back to the slides. Okay, so our PIT project emerged from our college's examination of equity gaps and the desire to use the spaces that are most impactful for student success, the classroom, or in this case right now, the virtual classroom. We also began this project at the beginning of the pandemic in fall 2020, and we recognized that the circumstances that were forcing all students into online courses would most likely exacerbate the gaps in student success and access, that the pandemic was going to be especially bad for students who already were disproportionately impacted. Given these circumstances, we had 3 goals for this project. The first one was the creation of a structure for focused, collaborative, faculty-led inquiry and equity-minded pedagogy. Our second goal was training, practice, and support in using equity-minded pedagogical techniques. And our last goal was to create a platform for sharing practices and inquiry results with colleagues, committees, departments, and our college as a whole. And just as a note about this final goal, we began the project with the recognition that not all faculty have the desire or the bandwidth for a lengthy project that's focused on equity data. And also that perhaps the faculty members that could really use to examine their practices for equity might also be the ones that were more reluctant to participate in this work. So we wanted to use this project to make it easy for people who were not on the teams to benefit from the analysis and the products and approaches that were developed by the participants in the communities of practice and the Pedagogy Inquiry Team project.
The PIT project evolved quite a bit since its initial beginnings, but it's important to note from the outset the way in which the need for this project arose out of a number of very specific contexts. Early conversations and planning for what eventually became the PIT grew out of the college work on AB 705 implementation, ongoing college equity initiatives, those existing kind of projects and conversations that were already happening, and the development of DVC's guided pathways and where we were in that implementation process. From the beginning, we tried to build a program in direct response to the college needs with an awareness of existing PD activities, kind of the sort of things that you're listing on your on the Padlet activity, and the kind of program that would work within our college culture. So one example of how this played out is in our use of communities of practice as a model, which was recently and successfully used in the AB 705 implementation by the English faculty in the English department. So we knew that the college had positive associations and experiences with communities of practice. In developing this program that sought to integrate all these related strands of work, the PIT project benefited from the support and collaboration of many groups, committees, and related professional development programs. From the beginning, we've sought to coordinate and collaborate with other projects throughout the process to benefit from their guidance and align the PIT work with the work taking place throughout the college. And you can see here, I mean, there's a kind of list of the different kinds of areas and committees that we were bringing into this conversation to see what would work, what would align well, what would be a real collaborative project for the college. Now, at the heart of the PIT project is the inquiry and action process. This process or cycle supports participants through various stages, examining data to identify equity gaps and related student needs, identifying instructional practices to address these needs, formulating ambitious and realistic objectives, preparing to implement the practice, implementing and assessing its effectiveness, and then using this assessment to inform further inquiry, the further cycle. This process looks quite structured, straightforward, clear when presented in these abstract terms in this nice image, but in reality, it's complicated, often messy, and it takes significant time. And that's not a bad thing, because the messiness and the difficulty, as we've kind of learned and experienced, can often be a sign that the participants are engaged in true inquiry, right? That they're grappling with difficult, complex questions and really struggling to make meaningful decisions and plans.
So when we were initially developing and launching the PIT project in fall 2020, we envisioned the teams completing a full inquiry cycle over the course of a semester. And we're just going to pause and let the futility of that, the ambition of that goal sink in a little bit. This slide provides a snapshot of our overly ambitious mapping of the inquiry and action process onto the fall calendar. What we learned from attempting this, particularly in a semester when faculty were adjusting to teaching online and facing multiple challenges due to the pandemic, was that we needed to adapt our plan and our timeline to respond to the needs of participants, the direction the inquiry was taking, and the emergent needs of the college. We ended up getting through step 2 with all of our teams, and we felt pretty good about that. We were upfront with participants from the beginning that we expected that the process was going to be messy, and also about the limitations of the data that we had. We knew that we were entering these unprecedented times and that the conditions of online learning during a pandemic was not going to match the data that we had from more typical semesters, especially typical semesters of online student success data. We were committed to using data and to being informed by it, but we were also aware of the many shifting variables and that we were going to need to move on with the inquiry cycle, even though we didn't have perfect data at the beginning of the project. So our reworked schedule resulted in a reconfiguration of the project as a 2-year inquiry and action process in which teams complete steps 1 and 2 in the first semester, as we did, steps 3 and 4 in the second semester, and then steps 5 and 6 in the third and fourth semester. As we mentioned at the outset, you'll note that we're speaking with you at the halfway point in this 2-year cycle. And while our teams have accomplished a lot so far, we hope that the value of this work will become clearer in increasingly measurable ways as we move into the final 2 steps of the cycle, and then even clearer over time as that 2-year cycle repeats, building on what was learned. This time frame seemed like it was going to work out best for our college at this particular moment in time, but it is not intended to be prescriptive. If you end up implementing a similar project, you may find that a faster, tighter time frame is appropriate for your context, and we might also end up tightening the timeline for the cycles, for future cycles as well, just kind of depending how it goes. So we're committed to really being adaptive to the project needs.
Great. So having provided this overview about how the project sort of developed into a 2-year inquiry and action process, we want to give you a little bit more detailed sense of the program structure for fall of 2020 and spring of 2021. In fall of 2020, we created 5 inquiry teams organized by our college's guided pathway interest areas. which were developed in those early phases of our guided pathways redesign. Now, each team was composed of 2 faculty facilitators from the interest area, as well as participating faculty. In the first semester, the teams were focused on completing steps 1 and 2 of the inquiry process. They began by looking carefully at college-wide, interest area, department, and in some cases, course-level data, identifying the most significant equity gaps on which to focus their attention, identifying unmet student needs related to these equity gaps, and discussing and selecting specific instructional strategies to meet those needs. Following a collective orientation at the very beginning of the term, where we kind of onboarded everyone and formed the groups, each team met every other week throughout the semester to complete their work. In doing so, in that kind of the rhythm of the semester and the structure of that first semester, a number of support elements were really important for the teams. First, each team was provided with college-wide and department level data covering a 5-year period, capturing enrollment, completion, success, disaggregated by ethnicity and gender. We used multivariable analysis, which allowed teams to consider intersectionality in their analysis. For example, we can look at data on male Latinx students versus Latinx students as a whole. And in future iterations, we look forward to adding other variables such as age to the analysis and things like that. And in addition to the data, right, this package data that we've provided to each of the teams, all the team members were provided with Tableau data training, and that's our sort of data system that we use, and written guides explaining how to set similar parameters and pull related data independently, so that they could go in and add in a variable or do this work and have that facility with the spreadsheets and the data analysis. Along with these data resources, each team was supported by the facilitators, by Chris, Al, Mark, and myself, who met with the groups of facilitators every other week throughout the fall to discuss how the teams were going, identify what additional supports were needed, and plan for each team meeting as it arose. In addition to the data and the planning meetings, each team also used an inquiry protocol workbook that we developed with the help of Al Solano, and also with feedback from the facilitators that broke the inquiry process down into a set of specific questions with examples to help the teams move from that data analysis piece toward action, right? Get them through the data to what they could do.
And we'll take a closer look at that later on in the presentation. So while there were a number of ideas, documents, and activities that grew out of the work each team did in fall 2020, and which we'll talk more in detail about later, the major outcome of the work that each inquiry team completed was an identification of promising instructional practices or approaches to prioritize. And this led to the creation of 3 communities of practice for spring 2021 that were focused on these instructional practices and approaches. So for us, these 3 communities of practice were culturally relevant and responsive teaching, equitable methods of assessment and feedback, and then one community of practice that was based on a group of related disciplines, equitable and inclusive classrooms in STEM. And that was because the STEM team that had been working in fall felt that they really had good traction, and they wanted to go further with it and kind of stay together in a discipline-related group, that would be the best for the work that they were hoping to do.
Yeah, so as you can see here, one of the major shifts that occurred between the fall 2020 composition of the teams and the spring 2021 organization of the communities of practice was that the 5 teams organized by guided pathways interest area in fall, by identifying common priorities and practices that they wanted to explore in a more diverse setting and advocating for the creation of these communities of practice, then we blended those guided pathways interest area within these communities of practice. So these blended COPs served as a community within which faculty could learn about the practice and develop an implementation plan with colleagues from a variety of disciplines.
The primary goals for the communities of practice in spring 2021 are the continued creation of a faculty-led inquiry process into equity-minded pedagogical practices, sounding familiar from the previous fall, a space to learn about these practices and create concrete individual implementation plans, and the creation of pooled resources, materials, and guidance on these practices for the broader college community. So the goals stayed pretty much the same from fall to spring. One of the key motivations in moving from the initial guided pathway interest area team structure into these blended communities of practice, and in having participants not only work on individual implementation plans, but offer collective guidance to faculty throughout the college, was to expand opportunities for participation and the reach of the work with each phase. So as an art historian, I really couldn't resist putting in a little bit of fine art into the presentation. And the image here that's illustrating the slide is by the Russian artist Vasily Kandinsky. And it's intended to symbolize that we hope that there's going to be many spheres of influence and engagement with the project, that we are encouraging participants to share their work in ways that will impact the larger college community, including presenting data at department meetings, using division and department meetings to discuss approaches and interventions that are designed by the communities of practice, sharing resources and giving flex workshops. And all of those have actually already happened and have arisen spontaneously from the teamwork in the fall and spring so far. And we hope that they will continue and that there's going to be many paths and many different levels of engagement with this work.
In addition to holding a collective orientation at the beginning of the semester, a mid-semester collective kind of check-in of all the communities of practice, and an end of semester collective share out in spring of 2021, the three communities of practice met on a monthly basis to complete steps 3 and 4 of the inquiry cycle, researching the practice that they were investigating and developing an implementation plan. As in the fall of 2020, the project coordinators met with all facilitators between each community of practice meeting to support this work. This is where we are in the inquiry process right now, with a set of enthusiastic participants who've each developed individual implementation plans on instructional practices, targeting equity gaps, and have been working collectively to develop guidance and resources that faculty across the college will be able to use to develop their own implementation plans for fall of 2021. Fall last year and this spring brought us through the first 4 steps of this inquiry and action process. Next year, we'll be focused on step 5, implementation and evaluation, and step 6, which is about reassessment, reporting, and preparation for that new continuation of the cycle. In fall of 2021, we'll be continuing with the communities of practice meetings and onboarding additional faculty members who have developed their own implementation plans using the guidance created by the communities of practice this spring. As the COPs support the work of implementation, we'll also be engaged in the work of assessment to evaluate the efficacy of these practices. So in addition to supporting the implementation and assessment, next year will also be a time for continued outreach and reflection as we look toward future iterations of the entire cycle.
All right, so in this slide, we wanted to provide a slightly more detailed sense of what kinds of assessment we're developing for next year to track the impact of this project and the efficacy of the practices. There are really 3 major forms that assessment is going to take in relationship to the project. And the first is simply tracking participation in the pedagogy inquiry teams, and then also the use of the resources. So tracking the number of times that the resources have been downloaded from Canvas and put into courses, tracking numbers of page views. So we have the ability to do that with our college systems. And so we're looking forward to just kind of tracking participation, you know, in that very kind of like broad way of access. The second is providing specific assessment tools the faculty will be able to use in their classes, and which will allow us to gauge the impact of the practices on students. We'll be using surveys for both faculty and students at the beginning of the semester immediately, like during the course of the semester, and then at the end of the semester. And we are still working out some of the details of those surveys. We had a meeting yesterday that I thought was very helpful in determining that. But that's still a process that's under development. And then the final method of assessment is a comparative analysis of student success data using Tableau, which is our enrollment management software that's probably also familiar to many of you, as I know it has wide implementation across the California community colleges.
Yeah, while we don't have, we don't have the completed 2-year inquiry cycle, and we don't have, therefore, sort of the hard data on initial efficacy, we look forward to tracking the effects of these practices as they become more widespread throughout the college. And although we have to wait for the full measure of the project's effectiveness, one of the most exciting things about the project so far, and that Chris has alluded to elsewhere, is the development, the creation of a framework for the next iteration of the project, and the development of the inquiry tools themselves. It's also been really exciting to see the way participation in this collective process has energized and empowered faculty members to create tools, activities, and products that they've been able to share with other members of the pedagogy inquiry teams, their departments, their areas, and their colleagues across the college. One example of a tool developed for the project that we hope to adapt in the future for future cycles is that Inquiry and Action Protocol Workbook, which, as mentioned before, provided the structure for each team to proceed with their work. We're adapting it based on what worked and what didn't work in fall of 2020, and in light of the continued evolution of the project. One of the key benefits of the protocol workbook was the structure that it provided to teams through what is essentially a very messy, complex, multi-stage process. It allowed us to set goals for different meetings, gave teams a consistent way to report progress and make their work accountable. It also allowed us to quickly identify when teams started to struggle with the pace of the inquiry process, so that we can make adjustments in the timeline, right? So it allowed us to kind of register what was working and what wasn't, and think about how we redesign accordingly. In addition to the protocol workbook, we also provided sample agendas and PowerPoints that teams could alter to their own needs throughout that process. And we found that it's much easier to create something by editing something that already exists instead of making something entirely from scratch. And we found that our facilitators have been consistently thankful for the different structural elements, support elements, and documents that we've provided throughout the process.
An example of the kinds of collaborative work that came out of the teams was the creation of a research and resources Sutori page that allowed participants in the fall 2020 teams to curate initial resources that then the 3 communities of practice in spring 2021 have been able to use as they begin steps 3 and 4. And for those who are curious, Ian just posted a link to the full page in the chat. What we have on the slide here are just screenshots. So Sutori, for people who might not be familiar, it's an online collaboration and presentation tool. I use it a lot in my courses. We chose Sutori because it's easy to insert multiple resources, including PDFs, websites, videos, and images into a story or timeline, and to organize and then share them. So you can see the screenshots here of a couple of the sections that correspond to the different communities of practice. So this made it really easy for all of our group members to contribute, comment on. So as you can see on the slide, there's a little comment function at the bottom of each of the posts or each of the resources on the Sutori page. So you can have a conversation about each specific resource, or use that as a way to be specific about your discussions of the resources. And it was really collaborative. I think it's really creative. It ends up looking really nice. So those were all benefits to Sutori. But of course, there's a ton of other collaborative tools that you could use. It's not like you would have to use this one. This was just a tool that did a thing that, it served the functions that we wanted it to.
Yeah, and finally, there were numerous faculty members who took the work they were doing in the teams and brought ideas, conversations, and questions back to their areas and departments. This included some members who reported on African American student success in math courses and specific methods to improve the success rate, members who shared reports on gender gaps in the engineering enrollment, faculty members who conducted department surveys on promising instructional practices that they could then share with their colleagues and with the PIT group, and teams who created guidance documents to share with their departments and their colleagues. Things like this, the culturally responsive pedagogy presentation that some of them put together. Now, all of these activities grew out of the core inquiry work that each team was doing as part of the inquiry and action process. In all these cases, we really tried to embrace faculty participant initiative and faculty insight into what works and what would be important for their part of the college to know, and the best way to share that information with their college, right? The way to kind of translate these ideas and these practices and this knowledge back to their areas. Faculty are currently engaged in building their own practices and assignments and college-facing materials that we hope will encourage adoption and participation among faculty who have not yet participated in the program, so that the impact is definitely greater than just the impact it has on the participating faculty. It's a much broader kind of outward-facing and very open process.
Our college slogan about SLOs is that they should be easy and useful. And I feel like that's also something that we kind of like brought to this project, that we want everything to be easy and useful for the faculty who might be accessing it, even if they haven't been immersed in all of the data in the first phase of the project.
Yeah, and a lot of kind of like on-ramps to the work, right? A lot of ways to kind of get involved, even if they haven't been involved from the very beginning. Yeah, excellent.
So we wanted to end the more structured, formal part of this presentation with a sense of the positive outcomes of the project so far. And really the spontaneous action of the participants in bringing back the actions, the insights, the conversations of the project to their departments is, I think, evidence of the deeper value of the project. We think one of the most important aspects of this project is the way that it empowers faculty to acknowledge their own agency or self-efficacy to meet student needs. One of the important conversations that took place in the Pedagogy Inquiry Teams when analyzing the data was thinking about what areas of student need could be met through instructional practice and what needs related to support from our partners across the campus, including student services. So a really concrete example of this is food insecurity, which is not something that an individual instructor could personally help with necessarily for a student, but they can become aware of and really help with that warm handoff of the student to the college food bank that might help students that are in need or that are experiencing food insecurity.
Yeah, and so there were specific components or parts of that inquiry protocol workbook that the teams went through that helped them to consider sort of what areas of student need overlapped with instruction and what areas were specific to instruction, which areas fell within sort of traditional student services side, and where the overlap was between those two things. And so we really wanted to help them identify sort of what areas they had control over in terms of their classroom, in terms of their own instructional choices, and that they could take action on. And in psychology, as our friend Mark Akiyama tells us, this is about self-efficacy and this locus of control, right? To use those terms. The PIT teams and communities of practice So they provided support for instructors to explore these ways of taking action. And they helped the participants bring this empowering perspective back to other areas of the college. The PIT project grew out of and seeks to expand this awareness, this like fundamental awareness of the responsibility and the opportunities that we have both individually and collectively to take action to meet the student needs and address the equity gaps in our classrooms.
All right, so we wanted to finish up with another look at the Padlet. And so as you have been posting into the Padlet, thinking about the current practices of your college, if you can kind of revisit those and think about those, and if you don't currently have equity-focused pedagogy training, or if you're hoping to make your equity pedagogy professional development into more of a program instead of standalone workshops, and like we definitely came from the standalone workshop context, right? People talked about our flex offerings as being potpourri style, was a term that that I heard a lot even before I became faculty PD coordinator. So I feel like we have a really strong culture of like individualism at DVC, where people were offering these like single workshops, but we were also noticing in some of the surveys that folks were feeling a little frustrated that they didn't have more of a kind of like combined and sustained opportunity to do a deeper dive into pedagogy. So that, we come from that context, just to be clear. So as you're thinking about this, we wanted to hear what would your concrete next steps be if you were going to put a kind of combined, unified pedagogy professional development program that used data? So like those three elements, the three columns that we had earlier in the first section of the Padlet activity. And we want to encourage you, I'm going to create a new column in just a second for the Padlet, to set an intention and commit to taking a small step towards creating whatever the ideal program would look like for your college. And hopefully you've gotten throughout the slides the sense that we don't think that this is a one-size-fits-all program, and that it was really a program that we developed out of trying to have a really strong awareness of our particular college's context. And that we don't think that there's any one right answer to this. So just speaking for myself, I had wanted for years and years to create a community of practice model of professional development, but I was always really overwhelmed by the idea, and I wasn't sure how to take the steps to make that vision of a community of practice model into a reality. It took Ian's initial actions and all of the stakeholder conversations that he facilitated step by step, one at a time, to start to build the program. So a small series of concrete actions that were conversations, proposals, and outreach presentations were really needed to move us forward on the project. And so what we're wondering, and hope that you'll participate in posting, is what would your first step be towards developing a program for your college? And if you already have a robust program, please take this time and space to reflect on it, and maybe use that column to offer advice. Is there anything that you'd advise for people who are hoping to build an equity pedagogy program of their own? So let me go over to the and move that and click save, and you should be able to post to that now. And we realized that this was a big question.
Big question. It's a big question. It's a big question, and I think it's a question that that can be answered, publicly in this way, right? But also just kind of privately, right? In terms of I was thinking like, if I was trying to start this from the beginning, who were the first people that I emailed, right? Who were the first people that I reached out to? What, you know, who are the contacts on campus that I felt like I needed to pull into those initial conversations? So that may be a kind of a private list in your head, but there's also these kind of larger first steps you could take. Chris, do you wanna run through the next slide while people kind of work on this, and then we can return to this with in the Q&A session and kind of talk about it as we move into that phase?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay, so while you're kind of thinking about that, reflecting on that, because we know that was a big question, we wanted to provide some answers to the questions that the organizers of the conference sort of specifically asked us to respond to in this presentation. And I think that a number of these we've answered in some way throughout, but we wanted to give slightly more kind of concise, direct responses to these questions. So the first question, how has this activity improved student experience? You know, we're not entirely sure in measurable ways how it has improved student experience yet. The instructors who are participating are deeply engaged in student success and in improving the student experience. And we hope that the model is sustainable and scalable, and that we're going to have those evaluation assessment mechanisms in place to start gauging what impact it has. And the materials that are being developed out of this project are intended for college-wide use to allow these practices to spread and to reach more students. So hopefully the sort of the impact is so large and so diffuse that it's effective in a way that's sometimes difficult to measure.
So question 2 asks about racial equity on campus, and I think so far the program has really empowered faculty to look at their individual course success data, which is just so key to to actually like transforming practices, and then also to be able to look at their department data in relation to the college-wide data. So our college has a practice of examining disaggregated data in our program review process, but we had not previously created a system for faculty to review equity data that was not tied to the resource allocation process of program review. And I think that's really key, because when you're asking for money, you're putting the rosiest glow on things possible. And when like this is a separate process, it's not tied to program review. And so therefore, I think people were able to take a look at their disaggregated data that was really less driven by desire for resources and could be like more driven by a desire for equitable outcomes for students. So for question 3 about data, we just addressed a little bit of that. So we use data in the first phase of the inquiry process to identify the most crucial equity and access gaps. These gaps were not consistent across the interest area teams. An example of this is in math and engineering. We actually had one math faculty and one engineering faculty, and they had completely different disproportionately impacted groups. You know, the engineering really, like the data came down to a lack of access for female students across all ethnicities. And, you know, for math, the gaps tended to be tied more to, to race in terms of course success. So that's just, you know, an example of the differences in the data. So we're about to enter the new phase of the inquiry process where we look at data again. And we realize that there's not going to be such a thing as perfect data, especially in the rapidly changing context of the pandemic and then the return to campus. It often, to be frank, in this program, it's often felt like we're blindfolded and throwing darts and sort of hoping that we're right about things. But we also believe that using imperfect data is better than not using data at all.
Yeah, and then in terms of student voice, this question, sort of what role does the student voice, engagement, ownership play in the effort? And there are a couple of different layers to this answer. For student voice, there are several places where student voice and ownership have impacted the program. The first is the student representation on many of the stakeholder committees that were part of this original sort of development and design of this project. So students have been present for presentations and discussions on the development of the project as it got off the ground and as it's evolved. The communities of practice topics are also predicated on student engagement, choice, and ownership. Culturally relevant pedagogy and equitable assessment are comprised of theories and practices that are student-centered and that involve student ownership in their education, including decisions about content and application. Finally, in terms of the assessment phase of the project, which will commence this fall, it'll be focused on student voice, right? Including surveys on with space for narrative responses and sort of open text responses that'll be given again at the beginning, throughout the middle, and at the end of the semester as we proceed through the fall semester, and faculty are implementing these practices in a very focused way in the fall.
And then the final question is about the guided pathways principles. And so the assessment and evaluation phases are like definitely really deeply engaged in the guided pathways principles. As we haven't completed these phases of the project, these answers so far have been a little bit broad. This is definitely about keeping students learning, keeping them engaged, and keeping them on the path to completion. Next year when we finish up, it would be really great to be back here if you hold this conference to share with you some more concrete answers about the assessment phase of the program and to be more specific about the effects that it's had.
Move into this Q&A session and also check in with the Padlet activity. So the question in the chat is, there's always a challenge involving students even without the pandemic. Which special steps have you taken to involve students beyond SAB, ASG? What can you clarify ASB as ASG?
Student government.
Oh, student government, yeah. Mm-hmm. So a couple of things. A lot of there's the student government. There's also the students who sit on different committees and different action groups are often not necessarily directly connected to student government. So a lot of our other kind of committees and groups have student representation from a kind of broad, diverse pool of students. So those opportunities to hear from students, to hear questions about the project, about the design, about the intent of the project, were really important. And then, of course, I mean, next fall is the core piece of thinking about student involvement and student voice, is we start hearing back from students about how they are perceiving these practices, how they're thinking about their classes, and then allowing us to not only gauge that overall, but also help communicate that to the faculty members who are doing those practices, who are implementing these pedagogical strategies. So that's some of the ways that it's been done. There's also I'll say that we also have in guided pathways we have a student focus group which has been providing feedback throughout the process of guided pathways implementation, and so that student focus group model has been really useful, I know, for a lot of the guided pathways work, and I think there's an opportunity in the fall for us in this project to also thinking about a student focus group to kind of get a different kind of response from students and feedback from students on the way that these practices are being implemented.
And we were really intentional in the guided pathways implementation on our college for that student advisory council to be comprised of a really diverse group of students, often that were not associated with student government specifically. So, you know, like we wanted a part-time student, we wanted an adult learner that's returning to campus, we wanted night students, you know, really like across different measures of diversity and inclusion. Thank you for that question. I want to take a quick look back at the Padlet. Yeah, so starting a guided path with the Guided Pathways group, and to start gathering a dialogue. Other questions that folks had, I can also exit out of the slide so that we can all see each other a little bit better.
And we're happy to take questions about nuts and bolts, you know. We can expand on any of the details. You know, a lot of this, you know, I think a lot of the conversations we've been having, a lot of the work was big coordination, high level kind of philosophical work about what are we doing and how are we kind of approaching it. And then a lot of it came down to, you know, the other side of it is all the nuts and bolts, the like, you know, how do people get paid? When do they get, you know, who gets paid? All the scheduling. And so one question I'm sure people have is about like what's the incentive? How are we incentivizing this, right? And I think that was something that we've thought a lot about in terms of our professional development at DVC. And we made the decision with this project that the facilitator roles were compensated, so they were paid at an other academic service rate, and so they were hired specifically to facilitate, because that facilitation involved a lot of prep work, a lot of organizational work, running the meetings themselves, and then the participating faculty members who sort of came to the work ready to kind of roll up their sleeves and do the hard work, but also sort of arrived at a project that was already formatted for them. They were eligible for our flex, the professional development sort of commitment hours that they have to complete each year. So that was one way. This was a way, as Chris mentioned earlier, of a faculty member deciding to spend their professional development sort of hours in a unified, cohesive way, rather than choosing a number of different flex activities. Any other questions or thoughts, reactions, ideas that are happening at your college, things that this reminds you of?
Feel free to unmute. Don't feel like you have to, you know, take the time to type it in the chat. Yeah.
Well, this just kind of brought it home to me that I'm not sure what we're doing at our campus about this, and it just reminds me more and more of how separated we feel after the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a thing, right? Yes. So yeah, I think that's real. That's a thing that we're all dealing with and struggling with.
Yeah, and Tim, I think that was one, you know, that's one of the things that I think in some ways it complicated this project a lot, the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Originally, way back, it seems like years ago, when we really first started planning this, we originally envisioned it as a two-day in-person summer institute that would do a lot of work, mm-hmm. and set people up. And then when we shifted to emergency sort of remote instruction, mm-hmm. that all changed. It all went out the window. And so we had to design this kind of thinking about remote participation, mm-hmm. Zoom meetings, mm-hmm. online. So I think that, you know, one effect of that, let me say this, like one effect of that is I think there were definitely, we developed it out of necessity, but I think that there's actually been benefits to the ability of people to participate. Mm-hmm. Given the fact that we are able to hold these meetings remotely, that people are able to Zoom in, it allowed for, again, multiple levels of participation that I think if we'd had an in-person 2-day intensive conference would not have allowed that. So, you know, again, yeah, I think it's been a positive outcome of some of this, is that it's forced us to think about accessibility of the project in ways that we wouldn't have if we just tried to pay everyone to be there for 2 days in the summer.
And we're going to roll over from remote learning into face-to-face. I mean, I did not want to take a crash course in it, but I'm relieved that this has been a crash course, sometimes involving actual crashing. It's just there are so many more tools that are going to be available when we get back with our human students in our human situation.
Yeah, and I think related to what Ian was talking about the evolution of the project and the accessibility of it, is that I've noticed that we have really a high degree of adjunct participation on the communities of practice, including in facilitator roles. And I don't know if this is also the case on your campus, but as I'm doing some of the end of year assessment for professional development for faculty, one of the things that we've been noticing is that there's this year we had a memorandum of understanding with our district that faculty had done all their professional development and they did not need to do any additional flex because of the significant labor involved in converting courses to online. And yet our workshop attendance is up. And a lot of that attendance is being driven by adjunct faculty. And so I think that there's been a real need for adjunct faculty development that hasn't been served, just because, you know, a lot of times the commutes have been too significant, or the the modalities of the professional development have not been what adjunct faculty need. So I feel like that, you know, the pandemic is going to end up with a significant lasting change in how we provide PD to adjunct faculty.
Yeah, they're going to have to be some more Zoom workshops. It's just a very efficient, way of doing it. And I mean, we want the human contact of being in the same place at the same time, but sometimes this will be a better way of delivering it.
Right, right. I know we have a hard cutoff on the time at the time. So I want to just take a moment to thank everyone and thank Michelle for the comment there. Chris, could you display the final slide again so they have our email addresses again? We're more than happy to communicate with you if you'd like to email us and talk more about this and follow up with materials and conversation. So thank you all very much for attending. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.